Dominaria United, Episode 5, A Whisper in the Wind. Teferi slammed a Phyrexian monstrosity onto Karn's worktop and pinned it with a knife. The creature squealed, spurting black, glistening oil from its octopoidal body, writhing in anger. Karn observed its thrashing with its passion. "The second saboteur I've found." Teferi managed the troops, acting as both a general and a quartermaster. No easy task in the new coalition, where so many species acted in concert as allies. "What damage did it do?" Karn asked. "It was in the food stores," the fairy said. "Joyra's checking them for corruption, but until they're cleared, dinner's off. You can imagine how our troops feel about that." Karn only understood organic beings' relationship to food in abstract terms, but he'd witnessed how missing even a single meal could cause Joyra to become irritable, even when starvation had not been an issue. Imagining that on a grander scale. "Is this interrupting Joyra's progress?" Had the creature found the food stores accidentally? Or had the spy given their location to Sheoldred? Karn had been unable to determine the spy's identity. Jaya, Joda, and Ajani had yet to arrive, and he expected that they would be able to help once they did. Joyra had occupied herself with setting up the self-destruct mechanism of the Mana Rig's helm, a priority now that Sheoldred's troops had begun to mass. They would not permit Sheoldred to obtain and convert the Mana Rig. If she did, she would be able to create power stones and apply Thran steel, which was nearly indestructible to her monstrous creation. Very shook. "It's installed, and he's currently linking the cannons into the Mana Rig's power supply." Pinned and writhing as the monstrosity was, Karn did not know what information it could transmit to Sheoldred. He placed one hand on it, removed the blade, tossed the creature in the crucible. It writhed, hissing as its blood boiled, its oil conflagrated, its flesh cooked, and its metal. "Your work on the Silex?" Barry looked worried. He shifted his shoulders beneath his breastplate. A buckle had come loose, but due to his still healing injuries, he could not reach around to adjust it. Finished. Karn had determined how to activate it, but he hesitated to say so aloud. What if it was not a spy that Karn needed to seek, but a spying device hidden somewhere aboard the Mana Rig? He stepped forward and tightened Teferi's breastplate, glad he had no need of such accoutrement. Organic beings' torsos being gigantic buckets for their organs was an obvious design flaw. "Please be still. I cannot risk harm coming to you due to badly fitting armor." It was too easy to think of you as a thing while watching you being built. Barry bowed his head. "For what it's worth, Karn, I apologize for how I treated you in the past." "I accept your apology." The klaxon blared above decks, summoning the troops to fight. The ferry broke out into a jog, and Karn followed him onto the upper deck. Then Joyra's workshop was located at the prow. From here, Karn could see the entire Mana Rig. The lower decks looked like a split globe. The two hemispheres joined with an assembly that supported the Mana Rig's legs. Although Karn could not see them from his vantage, he knew they clamped down onto the red desert rocks, fixing the Mana Rig to the cliffside. Similarly, the distant stern hemisphere was connected to the mountains of Shiv by a jury-rigged bridge. City buildings rose from both decks. Above him, the upper decks climbed toward the helm, located in an outcropping overlooked the front hemisphere. Goblins and Viashino disassembled food stalls wedged between the buildings and rolled out siege machinery to replace them. Mana cannons hung over the sides, pointed at the desert below. desert sea. The Phyrexians beneath the mana rig were so numerous, it resembled an iridescent pool in the bright Shivan light. Its surface heaved like a sea about to be breached by a whale, rippled, and then broke as an immense monstrosity arose from its depths. This was not another sortie. Teferi roared, "Status of the cannons!" "Not ready!" one woman shouted. The first wave of Phyrexians scaled the mana rig's sides. Coalition fighters shoved back their ladders, chopped off grappling hooks, and jabbed spears into the twisted beasts. A Phyrexian dreadnought lifted itself from the horde, whale-like in its immensity. Only no whale Karn had ever seen possessed a centipede's legs or mandibles. Stones plinked from its glistening black body, and small fibers writhed out from its armor plates as if tasting air. It lumbered toward the mana rig, its mandibles clacking. "Not hells," Barry muttered. "Aim for the dreadnought, for its thorax! Hold until you're ready to activate the cannons!" Joyra emerged from the lower decks, 2 human technologists at her heels. They rushed to the cannons and knelt, checking the final connections. Her assistants seated themselves behind the cannons, wheeling them to face the dreadnought. Cannons accumulated power, their snouts wreathed in burning blue flame. Joyra waved. "Fire!" Cannons released a crackling blast that slammed in the Phyrexian's thorax, cracking the metal and rocking it back into its own army. Blue energy burned between its armor plates. Joyra waved again, and the cannons blasted the dreadnought a second time, ripping through its weakened armor. Collapsed onto its own troops, crushing them. "Well, those are working," said Joyra. A shadow passed along the mana rig's decks. The weather light soared above them, and for a moment, Karn felt relief. Until he saw it loose a salvo at a cluster of Viashino, sending them scattering. "Oh no," he muttered. Now, looking closer, he could see that the coils and tendrils that had previously served as camouflage were no longer dead and inert. Even its cockpit was crusted over, blood and gore dried into a leathery coating over what once had been shining glass. The Phyrexian had completed the weather light. The ship swooped low, dropping twisted horrors from its decks, some small as cats, others lumbering and bear-like in their bulk. Interspersed with completed humans. Sheoldred must be hoping to overwhelm them, Karn thought, before Joyra finished installing the self-destruct mechanism on the mana rig. If these Phyrexians attacked Teferi and the Viashino from the back, the cannons would be left undefended. Karn moved to meet them. A humanoid Phyrexian leaped from the Weatherlight's deck onto the mana rig, silhouette strange, familiar. He walked toward Karn, his doubled-up arms raised. Pale, laden with metal spikes, was slicked back, and his eyes dripped black oil down his cheeks. He stretched his mouth into a grin directed at Karn. "It's been quite some time, old friend." Couldn't be. Yet it was. Your time. Karn had thought him dead. Whatever techniques the Phyrexian had used to revivify him after all these centuries had left what had made him act. How he set his shoulders, how he narrowed his eyes at Karn, how he flexed his hands, these mannerisms remained the same. "Hello, Enrale. How you doing? Thanks for the box. I can't see anything." High above, dark specks in the blue resolved themselves into dragons, diving for the completed weatherlight. The airship pivoted and gained altitude to engage the dragons, narrowly avoiding a gout of flame. Daragaz himself at the weatherlight's hull, clinging to the airship so that it wallowed in the sky. He used his bat claws to rake the weatherlight's draping intestinal cables like a cat gutting a rabbit. Karn faced airtime. Ertai opened his doubled arms in mock welcome. It's been so long since the Weatherlight left me for dead. Wall could have come back for me, but you did not. And now, look who captains it. A neat twist of fate. Not fate, Karn simply. Her design. She may think you're special, I said, but I know the truth. Anything that has been built can be disassembled. Ertai smiled and drew doubled arcs with his forehands, inscribing the dust-choked air with glowing magic. Karn advanced on him, and Ertai, with a flick of his wrists, shot the spell forward, faster than throwing knives. The glimmering light struck Karn. He expected it to bounce from his body, repelled by the careful wards Karn had enchanted himself with. It felt as though he had rusted solid, his joints rendered suddenly non-functional. I've had time to think about this during my revival, Ertai said. Time to plan, to redesign myself so that I could fight you. What have you done? Karn grated out. Ertai lifted his doubled arms, drawing Karn into the air as if Karn weighed no more than a piece of dandelion. That grasp tightened, squeezing. If Karn had been a being with lungs, he would have passed out. He clenched his jaw against it, but that gave him no relief from the agony that pulsed through him, emanating from his pleading. The metal body made a crumpling sound, denting beneath the pressure. Ertai opened slowly, finger by finger, unfurling his fists, but he did not release Karn. The unrecognizable, said Ertai. Beautiful and new. Frost loomed over Karn's body, a white sheen that coated his metal. He cooled. He could feel the metal contracting, stressed by the temperature difference between the Shivan desert heat and the magical ice. Ertai twisted his hands, a ringing gesture, and drew them apart. The tension changed from compression to a stretching as Ertai drew Karn's limbs away from his body. He was pulling Karn apart, limb by limb, like a cruel child torturing an insect. Karn's joints torqued under pressure. Metal gave way in Karn's shoulders and his knees. The joints bent and mangled. What would it be like to die? Karn had never contemplated, not as a realistic option for him. Death was something that happened to other people, a tragedy that he inevitably survived. Thought that he would always survive again. He had no way to fight this, no way to stop Ertai that he could think of, and the mana rig was being overrun. He would not like to die. Ertai grinned. The pressure intensified. If he was to die, he would first protect the Silex. Karn reached into the blind eternities, into the hum he associated with its magic, and drew forth particles of the hardest material he could generate. He visualized the dense, distant Silex in Joyra's workshop. He'd never generated material at such a distance from his body, but he forced it, hoping he'd get it right. He spun the densest carbon filaments he could from the ether, and encased the Silex in its lockbox titanium. Wove those filaments around the lockbox into an impenetrable mass. From this distance, it took tremendous will. He focused hard on the act of creation, rather than the sense of torsion in his torso, in his body. Or, like an excavator breaking stone, the golden Argosy swept through the Shiv's red mountains, stone churning in its wake, drew abreast of the mana ring. Ajani leaped from the Argosi's decks, dropping down behind Ertai. In one smooth motion, he drew his double-bladed axe from his back and swung at Ertai. The Phyrexian mage stumbled backward, concentration broken. Scream tumbled over the side of the mana ring. The magic gripping Karn eased, and he dropped to his feet. His knees gave way, and he fell. He was too damaged to stand. Ajani, his teeth bared, swung his axe down in a low salute. "I have returned to fight at your side, my friend." Karn, creaky from the intense pressures, inclined his head. He was glad he could do that much. He was no longer in fighting condition.
"And I am glad for it. We must defend Joyra's workshop."
"A workshop?" Ajani asked. "What of the helm?" "Joyra can hold it." Karn nodded at the helm, where it overlooked the decks high above and a good distance from the fight.
The Silex is in her workshop."
With a savage growl in reply, Ajani turned and laid into the Phyrexians. Grappling hooks launched from the golden Argosi as it drew in close to the mana rig. The Phyrexians still climbing the sides were crushed as the golden Argosi ground into position alongside the rig's stern section. The crew from the Argosi threw planks across the bridge the gap, and Jaya led the charge, followed by Danith the Capuchin in her house's colors, and Rada with her people's battle cry on her lips. The Keldan warriors and Banalish knights poured from the Argosi onto the mana rig's decks. They laid into the Phyrexians with their massive blades, cleaving the creatures into spare parts. Jaya raised a curtain of flame and drew it along the decks, herding the Phyrexians toward the Argosi and her troops. "Karn! How do you like your interplanar nightmares cooked?"
"I do not require sustenance. I do not require nutritional sustenance,"
Karn said. She rolled her eyes and threw up arcs of fire. "I'm unappreciated my time." The scarlet blaze whirled around her like blades, cutting into Phyrexian monstrosities. She lifted her hands, fingers clawed with effort, and electricity began to coalesce around her. With a great boom, a bolt of lightning coursed through the enemy ranks. Apparently, Karn was staring. When she next turned to him, she grinned. "What? I learned some new tricks." Behind them, over the edge of the mana rig, a vast and burnished Viridian shape rose from the desert sands far below. Visage, those branching horns. Karn knew too well. Sheoldred, affixed now to some nightmarish construct from the ancient wars of Dominaria, brought her small human torso level.
Karn!
Sheoldred spoke. Her entire body resonated, and her voice filled the battlefield, melodious with strange harmony.
"You have the Silex for me."
Karn's plan to use the Silex to draw Sheoldred out had worked. "Jaya, go to the workshop and get the Silex," Johnny said. "We must get it away." Jaya nodded, covering her own retreat with flares of fire. She backed into the workshop. Ajani and Teferi both flanked the doorway. Sheoldred moved forward, not so much striding with her many legs, as swimming through her army, gathering monstrosities into her body and incorporating them into herself as she went. She approached the mana rig from the side. Cannon fire rained down against her iron shell, but sheeted from her body. It did not damage her. Was she going for the joint between the mana rig's section? But Sheoldred opened the mandibles on her dragon engine body and slammed her chest into the mana brig's bow section like a battering ram. The thud boomed through the mana rig. From the hull, metal grated on metal, the vibrations traveling through the entire rig. She extended her legs out into the Phyrexian army, Her writhing fibers withdrew into herself as her army swarmed up her body, using her legs as ladders and her dragon engine body as a ramp onto the mana rig's upper deck. Karn hunkered down in front of the workshop door. Why hadn't Jaya planeswalked away with the Silex yet? Karn's damaged fingers were too bent for him to make fists, so he crushed Phyrexians between his palms, cognizant of two planeswalkers fighting behind him. He attacked Ajani and Teferi as best he could. He could not help but admire how Teferi fought, not only with a planeswalker's determination, but a father's. He was a man who decided to save his daughter's plane and his own. Even as Karn threw aside a monstrosity that looked like an assemblage of human, horse, and squid, he also remained aware of Ajani. He had to stay far enough forward to remain clear of Ajani's arcing blows. Ajani could spin that double-headed axe and sweep it through metal and flesh alike so smoothly that it took the Phyrexians a moment to consider what exactly was wrong before they slid apart. Oh cool, he's a samurai, that's rad. From the Phyrexian army's rear, reinforcements. Not, Karn thought, that they needed them. 2 more dreadnoughts. Immense metal plates covered their cables, pulsing organs and flesh, bristling with spikes large enough to spear 3 people through. Dreadnought lumbered forward. Else, Barry breathed behind Karn. Bellowed, "Ready the cannons!" "Don't know how we will emerge from this victorious," Ajani said. On the horizon, a shadow. A line of sudden and towering green. It almost looked to Karn like the edge of a forest. High above, Daragaz led his dragons into a wheeled dive of the dreadnoughts. Daragaz slammed his bulk into one of them and began to wrestle it apart, plate by plate. The Weatherlight pivoted in pursuit, its bat-like sails dexterous in Shiv's winds, harrying the dragons with sickly green blasts of light. Mana Rig shuddered, then thrummed. Karn could feel the heartstone in his core hum in response, a call and answer, like the beginning of a duet. Joyra must have completed her work. She'd woken. It stood, slow, inexorable. Everyone on, even the Phyrexians, stopped fighting to regain their balance, swaying as the Mana Rig lifted itself to its feet. Karn could feel his body press harder into the decking, the airflow squeaking through his damaged joints, clean and hot in comparison to the battle's filth. Hurt his dented. The remnants of the bridge connecting the Mana Rig to the desert tore away. Sheoldred screeched down the Mana Rig, and Karn could feel the entire structure lurch as she lost her grip on its hull. The Mana Rig was free. Sheoldred tripped, her balance disrupted. The Mana Rig strode forward along the rocky desert landscape, not graceful, but efficient, well-balanced, crushing Phyrexians beneath it. It scooped up rock as it went and spewed molten lava across the seething Phyrexian army. Karn could not see the details, but he could see results. Withering masses, shrinking as they burned, soon submerged under thick waves of molten rock. The Phyrexian army began to pull back, but the dark cloud Karn had spotted on the horizon had resolved itself into foliage trees. Rank upon rank of Magnagoths marched forward, darkening Shiv's deserts with their cool shadows and verdant foliage. The Mana Rig's lava drove the Phyrexians beneath the Magnagoths' branches. The Magnagoths tore into them, and Yavimayan elves, vibrant as bromeliads upon the Magnagoths' limbs, rained down arrows at the monstrosities beneath. A flighted Kavu glided onto the deck, and Joda sprang from its back. An elf with pale skin and dapples across her cheeks tumbled off after him. Maria. Joda had told him. So many planeswalkers, she said. It's an honor to fight alongside you all, and the mana rig is even bigger than I imagined. All around the deck, more gliding Kavu drop down, Yavimayan elves upon their backs. The fighting reignited as the Yavimayan elves charged the Phyrexians, spearing them through and freeing up the beleaguered defenders. Yoda raised a searing white light, enveloping the cannons and their operators in protective shields to buy them the time they needed to work their weapons. Cannons blasted the larger Phyrexians, knocking them out before they could attempt to breach the Mana Rig's defenses. Maria fell in beside Rada and coordinating her troops so that the Yavimayan archers formed up behind the Benalish and Keldon warriors. Waves of arrows arced over the Keldons and Benalish, studding the oncoming monstrosities. "We're saved," Barry murmured. From the tone of his voice, he had not thought reprieve possible. Karn. Jaya emerged from Joyra's workshop, stepping out into the space between Teferi and Ajani. In her arms, she held the titanium lump Karn had generated around the Silex. Her teeth were gritted as she lugged it out. It had not occurred to Karn that an object of that size and weight might be difficult for a human to maneuver. "I can't bring it through the blind eternities alone," Jaya admitted. It's too heavy for me to planeswalk with." Karn nodded. He passed his bent hands over the case, stripping off its protective metal coating. Then he waved again, and the lockless chest opened. The Silex gleamed in its box. It alone would be light enough for Jaya to carry. Finally. Ajani's voice sounded distorted. Not with bloodlust growl, but mechanical. Karn turned toward his friend. Ajani bared his teeth in an agonized grimace. He flattened his ears and clenched his good eye shut. His skin undulated as if worms crawled beneath his fur's surface. Jaya made it. The fairy stepped forward. No, Ajani couldn't be. Ajani's good eye widened with horror. He shook his head in denial and mouthed, "No, no, no," gripping his own arms as if he could restrain the Phyrexian fibers beneath his skin and prevent them from emerging. But they engorged, ripping open muscle and fur to reveal a sleek, dense Phyrexian musculature that had been installed beneath his own. Hi, Mara, welcome in. You just arrived in time for the sleeper agent reveal. Ajani had been completed. He was the spy, the traitor. He'd betrayed them to Sheoldred. Jaya clutched the Silex protectively in her chest. Still stunned, she took one step back, retreating toward the workshop. Fire flared around her, encircling her. His motion seemed to trigger Ajani. He swept up his axe and drove into her body. Jaya's back arched, and her mouth gaped in pain. Fell. The fairy raised his hands, his magic slowing Ajani's attack. Karn rushed the Leonin, placing himself in front of Jaya, hoping that anyone, would place a healing spell on her prone body. Ajani swung the axe into Karn's torso. Karn expected the blade to skid from his metal body, but it cut into him deeply, like he was no more than meat. Pain radiated up from the wound. Karn gripped the axe's handle and tried to wrestle it free, but the blade had embedded into him. Ajani passed him by, the fairy too drained to slow him any longer.
Sheoldred calculated your strength well.
The mechanical voice emanating from Ajani's throat sounded nothing like his usual growl.
The Silex and Karn, two of the artifacts the Whispering One wished to obtain on Dominaria.
You'd have to kill me, Jaya gasped, before I let you.
Yes.
Ajani said simply, hoisting her into the air with one hand.
You are dying.
Jaya coughed. Maybe, but not alone. Fire poured outward from Jaya's body, a white and scarlet conflagration. Ajani snarled and leaned back, his fur burning away to reveal blackened wires and cables below the skin, the air filling with charred oil. With a thrust of his ruined hand, he hurled Jaya over the edge of the mana rig. Barry gasped. Joda raised a frail cry. Karn tried to remove Ajani's axe from his body, but his damaged joints bent under the pressure. The blade did not budge. Silex was so close, right in front of him, where Jaya had dropped it. He'd avenge her. But Ajani had been right. Sheoldred had calculated his strength perfectly. Perhaps way more of himself in the caves of Koilos than he'd known. Ajani put his arm around Karn in a parody of friendship, gathering Karn to himself. With the other hand, he lifted the Silex and crumpled it in his hand, as if the ancient artifact were made of nothing more than paper. Karn could only watch in horror as the intricate runes lining the device flashed briefly, died. Sheoldred slammed, halting its advance and crunching it between herself and a mountain, rattling throughout the massive artifact's hull. The battle's tide turned yet again as Phyrexians dropped down from the mountainside onto the decks. Heldens, Yavimayan elves, goblins, humans, and Viashino now fought hard-pressed. Karn struggled against Bonnie's. Joda and Teferi stood stunned. It had all happened within seconds. Sheoldred split apart, her small humanoid half popping itself off its massive dragon engine host body, revealing a snake-like spine that she used for her insertion into her larger host body. Her humanoid part slithered down her massive torso and dove onto the mana rig's decks. Moved. Warned help, folded back. It did not show the gore and metal Karn expected, but rather pallid skin. Sheoldred revealed a fine nose, full lips, and large, dark, sorrowful eyes, like a doe's. No doubt she had harvested her face from some poor woman long dead. She pressed one small, pale hand to Karn's.
I have the mana rig. I have you. Dominaria is vulnerable to invasion. All the wonders of my people will become your wonders. All our beauty will become your beauty. There is only one truth. The next step in evolution will be completed.
All around the battlefield, Phyrexians murmured, "There is only one truth." The murmur rose from the ranks, softer than a wind from distorted mouths and far more eerie.
It did not happen like I planned it, Karn, thanks to your efforts.
Clutched the chain around Karn's neck, held his scrying device, locator, and the gadget he'd used to communicate with the Weatherlight.
No, this is better. I do have a plan, Karn. A plan for you, and for Dominaria, for all the planes.
I guess you're going to be disappointed. Joyra's words boomed, amplified by the rig structure. Because you won't get what you want today. A long pause, as if Joyra had to force herself to do what she knew was right. Karn believed in her. Then, an ominous ticking emanated from the Mana Rig's central structure. Joyra had triggered the Mana Rig's self-destruct mechanism. The golden Argosy broke away, racing into the sands. Joda! Joyra shouted. Portal everyone out, now! Joda wrenched himself to his feet. Around the Mana Rig's decks, portals whirled into existence, swallowing up nearby troops. The gaping soldiers who weren't sucked in got shoved through by friends quicker to understand what was about to happen. Joda pulled up a portal and threw Danitha, Rada, and Maria into it, shifting them to a safe location away from the blast radius. Assured that Maria's precious Kavu would not be left behind, enveloping it in a whirling portal. Lastly, Joda looked at Karn. His eyes bright with regret, stepped back through the final portal. The decks grew eerily quiet. Sheoldred with her stolen face unmoved. Ajani controlled, his arm a skeletal and charred ruin. Jaya had burned him. Karn waited.
I've acquired the targets. I am ready to return.
Sheoldred. Karn could not tell if she sighed with disappointment or satisfaction. And a scarlet light, at first only the size of a bead, materialized behind her. Lightning threaded it as that light expanded into a shining, whirling, scarlet globe. Roared with power, eating into the air and environment around it. It grew toward them, gnawing at the atmosphere. Sheoldred tilted her head and touched her face.
What a shame. I liked this one.
Karn struggled with Ajani's grip, but between his damaged body and Ajani's enhanced strength, he could not free himself. The ugly red light engulfed Sheoldred. She turned her face into its power with a small gasp as it washed over her. Its blaze burned over Ajani and Karn, searingly hot. Karn could tugged it. The very essence of what made him Karn, and it pull him away. Nothing more than an artifact. Object of a theft. As night cooled the desert air, Joyra and Teferi finished coordinating the survivors. Set up the triage tents. She had placed the few able-bodied reserves to search the battlefield for survivors and burn the Phyrexian dead. And then they both had worked with the Goblin and Viashino civilians. There had been a few who refused to leave their homes and evacuate. To inventory supplies, set up the camp beneath the Magnagoth's sheltering limbs, and ensure everyone was fed according to their need. Both exhausted. Speaking to Joda. After all that, Teferi did not know if he had the strength. But he summoned it from some deep reserve. It was what Niambi would have him do. Joda knelt on an outcropping, dry-eyed and surveying the battlefield's devastation. Troops picking amongst the survivors, scattering vultures. The banks of black lava steaming into the deepening night. He held, cradled in his hands, Karn's necklace, the scryer, the Phyrexian locator, Netherlight communicator, and a lock of Jaya's hair. Come, the fairy crouched beside him. You must eat something. Sleep. Yoda popped open the scryer's back and placed Jaya's hair into a locket. I can't let go of her. I just got her back. She can't be gone. Yet, I've known her across lifetimes, and we still have enough time together. The fairy felt a vast emptiness inside himself. He didn't have enough energy, hurt. He recognized it well. He had retained this numbness after Subira had died. It had taken years to wear away, to reveal enough rawness for him to grieve. He had mourned her for a long time. He always would. She'd been the love of his life and the mother of his child. Joyra joined them, her boots crunching across the gravel. We still have living friends who need us, Joda. What are Sheoldred's plans? What will she do with Karn and Ajani? Don't know, Joda said. How can we fight them without the Silex? Joyra sat beside Joda, cross-legged, put her arm around Joda's shoulders. The fairy contemplated the landscape. We will build Jaya a memorial that will outlast thee. Her strengths, her achievements, her wonders will not be forgotten. Shiv will become a site of pilgrimage. Yoda only shook his head. I'll stay with him, Joyra said. The stones rose from Shiv's red sands, an arrangement of white pyramids around an ever-burning fire covered mid-air. Yoda had set that spell himself. In the right light, when Shiv's winds hit it, the flame resembled a woman, turning away to hide her smirk, her pale hair streaming into nothingness. Danitha, Radha, and Maria had all returned to their homelands that their devastated forces could recover, and so they could recruit more troops for the inevitable Phyrexian return. Yoda, Teferi, and Joyra had remained to build this monument for Jaya. Teferi would miss her. Jaya and I met when she was... Yoda pinched the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes as if to hide their brightness. Swallowed. Dominaria lost a mage. The realms lost. I lost. I'm sorry. Joyra rested her hands on Joda's shoulder, and Joda leaned into that old familiarity. I never thought I'd have to do this, Joda finally said. The fairy cleared his throat, but didn't speak. He only shook his head, unable to put into words how much he'd miss her wit, the humor she'd brought to such serious tasks. Jaya couldn't save a plane without making a quip about it. He had imbued memories of her in one of the stone pyramids, her patience with Chandra, how she'd smile just before saying something really cutting, how they'd met. He'd never forget the day in Zalfir when he'd mistaken her for a line cook and asked her for a fried egg. She, grinning, had gone behind the counter to oblige and lit all the burners with a flick of her fingers, much to the actual stall-keeper's surprise. You want some chutney with that? Oh, he'd never forget her. The fairy walked in a circle around the monument. Sweat bloomed on his skin, and he wiped away the beads on his forehead. He paused to touch the empty pyramid they'd left for Karn to instill with his memories of Jaya if he... No. Once he returned. The fairy straightened his shoulders. Saheeli waited at a respectful distance, her jewel-toned clothing flickering in the wind, the gold accents winking, her brown shoulders burnished, and her black hair slipping down. At his "I'm ready" nod, he turned, and they left together. When Teferi stepped through the portcullis, had to suppress a shudder. They had reached it. Urza's tower. It was more than the worn flagstone emanating the previous night's chill. He never thought he would step into this place again. Saheeli brought him to an ancient, barrel-vaulted hall, its roofs stacked, well protected from the sun. He rested a hand on her device, which Teferi would use to heighten his magic's strength and precision. He was not eager to climb into it. With its platform, its leather straps and wires, it resembled a device found in a dungeon to elicit confessions, not a magical item made to heighten a planeswalker's innate talents. While the clay tablet Karn had found in the caves of Koilos had been lost, his drawings had not. Jaya had grabbed them. She grabbed the Silex. But unlike the Silex, the drawings had remained on Jaya's body, hidden in a secret pocket, clothes. Saheeli hadn't been able to determine how they described the Silex's workings. Only Karn had figured that out. But she had been able to determine when the Silex had been fired and made a perfect replica of her own. So this was now Teferi's mission. To return to the Win, to learn what Karn had already determined. How? How one activated? Good luck, Teferi, said Saheeli. For all our sakes. He forced himself to relax. A small, brown songbird perched in an arched window, then dropped onto the floor to bathe in the dust. Karn would have species, habits, to save his home, to save the multiverse. Barry would do the one thing he had vowed never to do. Cross time itself. The planar bridges, red light faded. Karn gathered from the chitters echoing throughout the darkness that he stood in a vast. He could sense mineral deposits, the weight of quartz stalactites overhead, and he could smell cold, damp stone. Felt ill, wrong, as if the turbulent passage through the blind eternities had coated his metal surface in an unclean film. He knelt, his crumpled body still aching from the battle on the Mana Rig's deck. He hoped the others, Joda, Joyra, Teferi, had fared that better than he and Jaya. Better not to think of that. Not till he could mourn. White lights flared, overwhelming his senses. The chittering noises stopped. Hellish Norn stood before him, glowing as though she housed a star. Her attenuated limbs had an insectile delicacy, and her long face had an arthropod's beauty. Her smile was narrow, self-satisfied, even as she scraped a servile bow his direction.
Welcome, Father.
Eleshnorn's voice was a throaty, pleasing falter.
Welcome home.
Karn looked around for Ajani, Sheoldred. He had seen the planar bridge engulf the traitor, as well as his completed friend, but he saw no sign of it. It must have deposited them elsewhere. Only he and Eleshnorn stood upon this plateau, heaped with drifts of white porcelain sand. Below the plateau, insectoid Phyrexians seethed in a glistening, white-gold mass. Norn grabbed his chin, wrenched his attention back toward her.
You have been away for far too long. We have missed you. You deserve to share in the glory of what is to come.
Karn tried to rise, but found he couldn't move his legs. He tried to summon his spark, to transport himself somewhere, anywhere. But he was too broken, too tired. Norn's claws dug into the metal of his cheeks, turning his head. His neck complained at even that motion, the joints grinding together. Then he saw it. A small, stunted sapling growing from the porcelain sand. Its gnarled, delicate branches reminded him of the small trees he saw above the timberline mountains. Its pale limbs glistened with an iridescent beads of oil hung from its twigs like buds. And now, in this hell surrounded by monsters, he couldn't help but feel a tenderness for that tree. A living thing fighting against all odds to survive?
What is it?
Norn leaned down at him, her rows upon rows of teeth spreading into a mocking rictus.
It is the beginning of great things, Father. It is the beginning of everything.